during this talk, I'm going to maybe flip backwards and forwards between people of colour and political black with a capital P. So now to introductions properly. So I'm defined as a scholar activist, a QTPoC activist, and I have a background in organising in queer and trans people of colour communities. I helped co-found Rainbow Noir, which is a Manchester group that's been running for 5 years now, which is a group for LGBTQ people of colour, and has around 70 people that attend from across the Northwest on a monthly basis, up to 70 people. And I co-founded it with 3 other black queer women in 2013. And this talk I've kind of developed for today, I want to kind of go in between the histories that I have explored and found, and also a bit around my research, which was on queer and trans people of colour for my PhD, as well as my own practice as a QTPoC activist. And so I'm not a historian. I think that's the first thing to say. I'm not a historian. I'm like a psychologist in terms of discipline. So these are definitely going to be partial histories. They're not full histories. And there's things that are definitely missing, in particular trans histories. I can talk to current like QTPoC struggles, but in terms of histories, black trans histories, there is a kind of silence around those, or there's a limited history. But the focus of my work is around the need for belonging and community for QTPoC, and why I have developed this organisation, and also to look at the history and how I found developing Rainbow Noir within Manchester and the specific histories in Manchester. So, before I started Rainbow Noir, I was in Manchester and I was really desperately looking for other black LGBTQ people. I was always looking for some kind of community, for elders, some kind of representation or visibility, and there was very little until I met the 3 women who were involved, who I ended up co-founding Rainbow Noir with. And by chance, we met Maria Noble, who is a local Manchester historian who was involved in black lesbian organising in the 70s and 80s, which I kind of couldn't believe. I couldn't believe that there was definitely a community of black lesbians in Manchester who had organised together, and that she was still there and she was talking about this history. And then also I worked at the Black Health Agency, what was a Black Health Agency in Manchester, and in the library downstairs in the basement I found this book, which kind of blew my mind. Basically it's a collection of black lesbian histories in the UK, and it has a huge list of organisations that existed across the UK, Bradford, London, Manchester, Liverpool, all over the place, of many black, lesbian and gay organisations that I had no idea that they existed. So this, yeah? Oh, yes, sorry, is that better? That's okay. So this book was incredible. So to read about these organisations that had existed, and to know actually that, you know, I wasn't the only one. I wasn't kind of an aberration, just like a random black bisexual woman, if I couldn't find community. And then I learned a bit more about the history of the Black Health Agency. The Black Health Agency just started off as a grassroots campaign around HIV prevention in black communities in Manchester. And that at the forefront were black lesbians involved in that struggle. These were all hidden histories that I was gleaning and finding parts of as I connected to different people around Manchester. And it was, incredibly powerful to know that we had always existed, except our histories are maybe hidden. And for me to understand, as we developed Rainbow Noir, that we were part of a continuum, so that we hadn't started the work, actually others had started the work, and we were going to continue to develop it, and other people would come ahead of us. And that was really powerful for me to know. So from reading this book, from talking to black lesbians, and also a lot of Valerie Mason-John's work, I learned a lot more about the black lesbian struggle in the UK. So, and particularly as now, always the problem with intersectional struggle, that there's always a struggle to get intersectionality on the table. So I think you've talked a little bit about the black women's struggle in the UK. The Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent launched in 1978, which I might have talked about already this week. And lesbianism and sexuality were issues that caused divisions in the organisation. And at the 1981 conference, there was a lesbian workshop timetabled, and this caused some rifts in the conference. So some of the women said that was a kind of divisive issue. We should be looking at more at the wider issues that affect the Black community, particularly in 1981 with the riots. And some of the lesbians who attended the workshop were told that they should be mashed up, that they should get out, that this wasn't a Black issue. However, the workshop did go ahead, and 40 women attended the workshop and found it incredibly powerful to be in a room with 40 other Black lesbians, to know that they existed. And again, I think this is the common theme in a lot of this, is that being able to know that other people exist too, you're not alone, and kind of grappling with the difficulties of addressing race, gender, sexuality and intersectionality. So the workshop happened, but actually the division that it kind of created, the rift that it created, was seen as contributing to the end of the organisation of OAD, of the Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent. However, despite that division, out of that lesbian workshop, the first Black lesbian group was developed in London, and it tried to meet in Brixton, but it wasn't allowed to meet at the Black Women's Centre because they felt that the Black Women's Centre already got quite a rough deal from the Black community for having a women's centre. So having a lesbian group meet there was seen as just maybe adding fuel to the fire. So they met at other places in London. But it met fortnightly, this group. 30 to 40 women attended each fortnight. Some as far from Scotland would come down. They would pay for each other's travel to meet. And this really heralded the beginning of a kind of explosion of Black, lesbian and gay organisations and networks that developed during that time. So these are just some of the lists that I've found. So like Gay Asian Group, Black Lesbian and Gay Centre in Peckham, that exists in Peckham, the Lesbians and Policing Project, LesPop. A lot of these were funded by the Greater London Council, and they supported people in their experience of being multiply minoritised. So what it means to be Black and queer and a woman or a person of colour. They campaigned and gave advocacy on issues around immigration and for gay and lesbian people. They challenged homophobia in media and culture, particularly in Black media, around the voice and the representation of Black gay people. And they developed media and culture such as publishing houses, Outright magazine, which was an anti-racist, anti-imperialist lesbian magazine that discussed the issues of lesbians across the world. So kind of incredibly wide range of campaigning. We had the Young Black Sammies, Black Lesbians Brought Up in Care group, also had Black Lesbians and Gay People of Faith, Black Perverts Network, which I think is really important to mention, because I wasn't sure whether to include them, actually. And I think that's part of maybe internalised issues around respectability, like when we're presenting LGBTQ information, do you want to talk about sexuality? You want people to accept. But actually, yeah, so there were private parts of Black and Asian men, which I think is incredibly powerful when I first found out that they existed. That's quite exciting to think about sexuality and pleasure and Black activists reclaiming sensuality and pleasure. It's something that we don't often talk about in Black communities. And then there was also the Wages Due Lesbians group, which I'll talk about now. They were a kind of a white and lesbian solidarity group, and they called for kind of economic justice and anti-racist struggle. So they wanted to address the unpaid labour that women do in the world around childcare and sex work, all different kinds of labour. And they kind of fought for, to quote, the Black woman not to be torn between her Black and lesbian identity, and they highlighted the link between homophobia, poverty and economic exploitation. And the Wages Due Lesbian group was actually kind of an international group, so there were different chapters across the world, but there was a chapter here in London, and they supported campaigns for the rights of lesbian mothers against Section 28, which was a Tory law which banned the literature and promotion of homosexuality in schools from 1988 to 2003, and that law covered the complete time I was at school. So it wasn't legal while I was at school for people to talk about LGBT stuff or to give us any information. They also campaigned against the testing of AZT, which was an experimental HIV drug that was tested on HIV-positive African children, and they kind of showed how, as lesbians, their struggle was interconnected with other people's struggle across the world. So both local, national, and international struggle, and anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggle too. But for me, in exploring these histories, there's always this ongoing question of what it means to be Black and queer, and the kind of existentialist dilemma of what it means and how we can exist in the world, as a dilemma of being marginalised in race, gender, and sexuality. So in my research, I found a common theme was a question of how do we belong, or where do we belong? If we don't belong in Black communities or white LGBT communities, in our homes or countries of origin, how can we exist? And where can we proliferate? Where can we thrive? So I think it's interesting to think about the diaspora. So I brought up Hall's quote here about the diaspora and this idea of home, and I've been thinking a lot about the maybe Black political rhetoric around sexuality, or the silences around sexuality and gender diversity. So Hall, to quote, "The diasporic attitude often finds itself compelled to look back to something, a ground, a beginning, which may never have existed, or exists only in remembered form, or is now so embedded in fantasy, memory, or desire that it constantly escapes us." And for me, during my PhD, my participants talked a lot about the difficulties of being in white LGBT spaces, the racism that they experienced, but they didn't talk a lot about the homophobia they experienced in Black communities. And I didn't want to ask them. I felt protective of Black communities. I was like, I don't want to air our dirty laundry, right? Especially in academia. And so I definitely shied away from homophobia in Black communities, but also the silences and the difficulties around talking about sexuality and gender diversity. And I think there's a particular idea, particularly in Pan-Africanist politics, of a originary ideal society in which was heterosexual and was this normative, and this idea that LGBT people didn't exist before colonisation. And Jackie Alexander talks about this nostalgia for an originary, unambivalent moment for the heterosexual founding of a nation that is tied up in anti-colonial ideology and the heteronormativity of it. And for my participants, they didn't talk about homophobia, but they talked about some of the silences and the difficulties they found. And for example, one participant, Sasha, she was a youth worker, and she was in a college, and she had a stall on LGBTQ History Month, and a group of young Black men came up to her and were talking to her about sexuality, and they were being quite homophobic to her, and she felt, as a mixed Black queer woman, she could manage their homophobia, and for her it felt more like a performance or something they were doing together. And the group then left, but one of the young boys stayed behind and talked to her, and he said to her, if I was rich or if I was white, it wouldn't bother me, gay people wouldn't bother me. And she talked to me about it. She said that was just such a compelling quote, a kind of anecdote to share, because she was saying, actually, he was saying if he had maybe more economic power, if he wasn't from, if he wasn't having to perform a certain type of masculinity, he wouldn't have to perform homophobia or homophobic insults. And for her, she began to think about her own preconceptions about homophobia in Black communities and how it works, and particularly about the ways Black communities are scarred by histories of colonialism and slavery, and the already pathologized Black body, and how that impacts whether we can talk about sexual or gender diversity, whether we can talk about sex and pleasure at all, with the gaze, the colonial gaze and the white gaze on us. So a couple of my participants talked briefly to that, and I think that's an interesting thing to think about the ways Black communities are already pathologized, and how that can shut down the possibilities for us to talk about things like gender and sexual diversity. And for me, I think now I'm a bit more critical about the ways that can shut down conversation. So, particularly in regards to politics. So, in terms of Pan-African politics, or ideas about a originary African ideal of Blackness, and how that continues to limit the ways that we can talk about gender and sexual diversity. So, QTPoC activism, for me, exploring those histories, there is a challenging of the silences. And in my PhD research, there was a lot of talking about trying to decolonize gender and sexuality, and how queer and trans people of colour are often stuck in a weird sort of place where they, in terms of the cultural wars, so in the Caribbean, where my family are from, there's the idea that queerness and transness are colonial inventions rather, and that before that there was no queer or trans people, and actually thinking about, and then when we try and discuss how actually it was the colonial invention, homophobia itself, the homophobic laws were brought into the Caribbean and into that African continent, that's not considered, and that's denied. And so QTPoC are in a difficult, tense position in which they're in between these arguments, and often seen as neo-colonial arguments in terms of embracing LGBT identities in the Caribbean and in the African continent. So participants in my research, but also in Jackie Alexander's work, talk about trying to develop a counter-hegemonic memory of what queerness and transness was, maybe before colonisation, or how they still continue to exist. So in terms of Zami or Mati work, or Man Royals, so Zami is the Caribbean term for women loving women, and women living in community together. So it might not directly translate to lesbianism or bisexuality, but some Black lesbians find it powerful to reclaim those, to show that they have existed, and to challenge the silences around gender and sexual diversity. And then, thinking about, for me, the power of people like the Black Perverts Network and Black activists who are talking about sexual desire and pleasure and sensuality, making space to reclaim those things. So in Tongues Untied by Marlon Riggs, him talking about Black men loving Black men as the revolutionary act, which is powerful in terms of rejecting heterosexist and masculinist ideas of what it means to be a man of colour or a Black man. And I think I'm going to end it there, because I wondered if anyone has any comments or questions. Thank you. Yeah, so a lot of them were like safe spaces, so support, really kind of more support groups. And there's like such a huge list of like support groups in this book, like so many, and like multiple in like one city. So for me, yeah, that brings up the question of why people need those support groups and safe spaces, and why I've been involved in those groups myself. But yeah, so probably a split of support and then also advocacy and campaigning. Outright. Yeah. Outright. Let me check. I've got it in here. This has a wonderful like chronology of it's March 1982. It started and then folded in 1989. And unfortunately, yeah, a lot of these organisations, folded once the GLC stopped funding, and also a lot of it was because of burnout too. Yeah.
A lot about like silence.
I think that's a really good question. It's around like intersectional struggle, I suppose. Keep pushing intersectional struggle, and like when I was doing my PhD, I definitely was wary of talking about issues in Black communities, and then Pulse happened. So the nightclub shooting, and it was like all queer and trans people of colour, and there were like silences from prominent Black activists in the UK, and it really hurt, right? And so before I was like, oh, maybe we'll just be quite quiet and we kind of do our own work as we go along. And actually, no, now I'm like, no, we need to push gender and sexual diversity onto the table all the time. And I think for me, it's tied to all of our liberations. When I was talking about the young person who was talking about being homophobic and it wouldn't matter if he was rich or white, like for me, if we put gender and sexual diversity on the table for everyone, and we talked about the ways Black people are constrained by racist ideas about their sexuality, that could like free us all up, right? So for me, it's always putting it on the table. Was there any? Yeah. Yeah, definitely. I think they're all interlinked. But I think if Black trans people the most like minoritized, and I think we need to centre the most minoritized people, and by centering them, it frees us all, like in terms of the way gender socialization affects all of us. And the way we police each other, if we could break that down, that would be, liberation. Yeah.
I was just going to say, following the Orlando shooting, it seems like more people are talking about everything in terms of being, so for me, being a woman, lesbian, South Asian, and being a person of faith. Yeah. So they want to talk about all of those subjects. But I think that even in the LGBT community, it's more open, allowing that space to widen, so that there are conversations that are being had that cross over. If you want us to come as a whole person, you have to be inclusive of all of those.
Yes, yeah, totally. And that was like in my research over and over, this idea of you have to leave certain identities at the door of different organisations, right? You cannot be your whole self. And that's incredibly painful. For me as a psychologist, I find that really interesting because it's, where do we find the places where we can be whole? Yeah, thank you.
I love that you clarified the terminology.
Okay, that's okay. Yeah.
Can I ask you, whilst the Black community are trying to separate off and have different identities and different subgroups, why has the queer community amalgamated? Is it useful? Is it helpful? So I had a conversation with someone that they were transgender and they didn't like being associated as being gay. They thought something very different. And I was fascinated by their argument.
Yeah.
So is it helpful to congregate?
Like I can see why that person wouldn't want to be defined as gay, but transgender is about their gender identity rather than a sexuality, right? Yeah, right, yeah. I suppose it's hard because like when it came to like the OAD conference and they said, oh, we should be just focusing on issues that are a problem for all of the black community. And it's like, well, like issues of sexuality affect all of the black community actually, and black lesbians and gay men, bisexual people and trans people have always been at the forefront of community organising actually, and then we get ignored by history. So I think, again, like I was saying before, I think centering, being intersectional, it helps liberate us all, because gender and sexuality doesn't just apply to queer people and trans people, right? But it's difficult, definitely, doing intersectional work, because it's ongoing, right? Yeah. I think that answers.
Well, I just want to know what is the aim to put everyone in the same box?
Well, yeah, I think you don't have to always be in the same box, but it's that there might be black LGBTQ struggle, but knowing that wider black activists will take that struggle on board as their own, in the ways that black LGBTQ people take on, community people. Yeah.
I was interested to know a bit more about your research.
Yeah, so in my research I did focus groups and interviews with QTPoC activists from across the UK, and that was about 4 years ago now. And yeah, I was exploring why do people get involved in QTPoC activism, what does it mean for them and their own sense of identity, and the big things that came out of it was issues around belonging, feeling dislocated. People often felt, before they found QTPoC spaces, they were just like, I don't belong, why don't I belong anywhere? And a lot of them talked about internalising it, saying there must be something wrong with me. So finding it quite powerful to be then in QTPoC spaces where they were naming similar experiences and realising, it's like consciousness raising, right? And so that was incredibly powerful. And also finding the language. A lot of my participants are mixed race and talked about finding the language of what it means to be racialised. In the UK, how difficult it is to find that language, to know that you're being othered, experiencing it as a feeling but not actually being able to name it, but then also intersecting with their gender or sexual diversity. And that was particularly an issue for like trans people of colour. So they found, a couple of the participants found that they were in white sort of trans communities, and a lot of the literature and a lot of the discussions they were having with people just didn't really fit right. And they then found with other trans people of colour, they then realised actually, in terms of transition, if you're transitioning into a trans man, you're transitioning into another like racialised gender. Right, and so this one participant talked about coming back to London and feeling like this, the trans white people I know don't seem to have the same experience as me. Talking to trans people of colour, actually, as a South Asian person, I'm now racialised as a man, and that is a lot to manage. And that's particularly around the time of John Charles de Menzies being shot. And so this participant was like, well, actually, yeah, I'm now transitioning into a person who is seen as dangerous suspect in a way they weren't before. So needing those spaces to be able to understand their own experience. So there's that, a lot around belonging, dislocation, decolonizing gender and sexuality, trying to link decolonizing with one participant called it cis deprogramming, so no longer being cis, and those intertwining together. And then the difficulties of being in community, which I think you've talked about a bit today already, but ongoing questions of how do people who are multiply minoritized and often have experiences of trauma and being very isolated, how do you come together in community and care for one another? And it's not a utopia, and an ongoing question of how we manage those conflicts and disruptions.
What were the findings in terms of the
Yeah, self-care. How difficult? Like, this is a question that keeps coming up in my like activist work and in the research. Was what do you do when it comes to conflict and harm? What happened to someone's abusive? But also knowing that hurt people, right? How do we not ape the prison industrial complex in the ways that we relate to one another when it comes to abuse and harm? And burnout and the lack of resources. So a lot of firefighting. So if people that are very minoritised don't have enough resources to support one another in the ways that people maybe in wider society do.
So a lot of the kind of history that you talked about, which is really fascinating, and I listened to a lot of stuff I hadn't seen before, is very much about kind of black LGBT struggles that come out of a kind of leftist feminist movement or an anti-racist movement.
Yeah.
I guess I was wondering if you'd seen a kind of history or found a history of more mainstream or more like party-oriented black queer spaces, because I feel like something else that we think a lot more about the time that people spend like on demonstrations or things, long meetings and 10 minutes in, but actually so much of like queer of colour life.
Yes.
Much more geared around, or like there's also an element of that that is about music and partying and dancing and going with someone.
Yeah.
If you found that in the archive.
Yeah, there's a little bit about the explosion of blues nights. So nights where black lesbian women's homes just open up because there wasn't any other space. So having parties, paying in, particularly in like places outside of London. So a lot of that. And then also in my research, there was a lot around kind of micro affirmations I talked about. So at Pride, the black nod, but like how that intersects with queerness, so the black queer nod, and the ways that when you're out dancing together, the joy and the eroticism of being together and being seen as black queer people, how powerful that was. And in my research, I talked about how could we utilise that joy and eroticism and being seen to create a stronger community, rather than community that can often be quite fractured, right? Yeah. Thank you for that question.
I was going to ask, you know how homophobia is really well known, like masculinity doesn't really fit that idea. Is it just as much as a problem with lesbians as well? What is that like?
As in like homophobia towards lesbians?
Yeah.
Or I think in the archive or just generally. I was surprised by the what happened at OAD in the Organisation of Women of African and Asian Descent. People were shouting at the lesbians like "mash them up" and "get them out," and, so there's homophobia directed towards lesbian women. But I think with my participants they talked about that too. But I think like me, my participants were on this like line where they felt protective of their community, but also be critical, and that's I think a difficult place to hold. That's difficult for black women as well. Yeah. That's a question. In religion, religion and colonisation really. So it's like the British brought the kind of sodomy and robbery laws to Africa and the Caribbean. And actually in MJ Alexander's book, she talks about actually the sodomy laws in the Bahamas were actually to protect the white colonizer from the colonised. It was nothing to do with the indigenous people. It was to protect the white man from the activities that they had seen on the island. But now the Bahamas embrace a rhetoric, this idea that there were no such thing as LGBTQ people before colonisation. So it definitely has links. It definitely has links with colonisation and religion. Definitely introduction of Christianity in some parts of Africa. I think there are issues there in black communities. I didn't find that much in my research. There's a lot more research in America around black churches and homophobia, but also how black churches can also be a source of strength for LGBTQ people too. Yeah, I'm what they call a fruity psychologist. so I'm very like left field, right? So people often say to me, are you like in psychology or sociology? You should be in sociology. But yeah, so I'm much more critical psychologist. So I'm interested in the ways that political and social contexts shape us and who we are, whereas mainstream psychology is very much individualistic and ahistorical. And so I'm trying to bring in like ideas about coloniality and how they shape us into psychology, because it really needs it. So yeah, we'll see how I go with that. Cool, lovely, thank you.